Howdy.
Hey, how's it going?
Hey, how you doing? I'm doing well. How about you?
I'm doing okay, all things considered.
Nice. Yeah, all things considered. So we've had an interesting couple of news days.
Yeah, we surely have to be blunt about it. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you know me, my hands are tied. I can't talk about this without someone watching me and having their hand on my shoulder. I need a supervisor, a babysitter, as it were. So,
Yeah, you have some real nuclear takes on this issue.
that's true. That we disavow and have walked past, by the way. And we're hyperbolic language to begin with, intended for comedic purposes. Um, okay, let's give you a unhelpfully vague question. What's your take on what's happening right now?
My take generally is that the recent escalation, I would pin the earlier escalation when it comes to Al-Aqsa Mosque and the evictions on the state of Israel, and that the quote unquote evictions out of the East Jerusalem are disgusting and a human rights abuse. I think that the fact that they raided the third holiest site of Islam is disgusting, utterly repulsive, and of course was going to lead to an escalation. I think the airstrikes have been used an overwhelmingly to cause destruction in the Gaza Strip. Over 50% of the casualties so far, according to the Gaza Ministry of Health, have been civilians. Many of them children, a decent amount of them children. We're probably going to get a same amount as we did in the 2014 war, as we did for the amount of children killed there. There have been UN schools bombed, and it's utterly repulsive to me.
Yeah, I actually learned about that from your Twitter. That one of those I don't remember the casualty numbers, but that yeah, a UN school was bombed. That like UN schools they're flagged as UN schools. They
Yeah,
have
they're flagged. They literally have giant flags out them. The thing that's important about UN schools is not only that since the Gaza Strip has a 48% unemployment rate and a terribly underserved infrastructure, those UN schools are a vital resource for children to have access to like avoid radicalization, to get an education, and to just play and like have somewhere safe to be. Uh, the problem is also that with the recent conflict, many Palestinian civilians are fleeing the border regions and they're going to UN buildings to hide and like stay safe. And with UN buildings also being blown up and the destruction of UN buildings clearly being against international law, that is something that's really scary. Now, the counterance to this is in 2014, it was also proven that Hamas has used UN schools to store rockets. My response to that would be that doesn't mean you still blow up this building with it being extremely vital infrastructure, with it being still against international law. There's a million other targets that they could have targeted besides the UN school. And considering how vital this infrastructure is, I think it does much more damage than any good by destroying it.
yeah, I can't say I
But
disagree.
but that would also prove to me how disgusting Hamas is. The fact that they would store active military equipment next to where children are playing in the playground, right?
Yeah.
Like, yeah, that also blew me away because I remember having a debate with somebody on this, and I was giving them statistics, and I'm like, "What? Do you think the UN is working with Hamas?" And then afterwards, reading documents and be like, "Well, the UN wasn't working with Hamas, but they were actually storing these weapons in UN buildings. This is utterly repulsive."
The I mean, you could make an argument that Israel benefits from keeping the Palestinian population stupid, uneducated, and radicalized. The more of them that turn to Hamas, the greater a justification Israel has to engage in the behavior they do. You know?
Well, I would say that, of course, the thing is, I would say that any economy that is underdeveloped has a less of an ability to develop an effective military. This is why a lot of like people say we shouldn't trade. We need to do decoupling with China because the idea is if we decouple with China, then they'll be unable to rise to great length. But I deeply disagree with the theory. I think international trade is something that decreases international conflict. I think we're not going to be able to get the rest of the international community to trade with China. But there is this idea that if you stop somebody's economic rise, then you're going to stop their ability to like resist or like build up a military, and that would be similarly true for the Gaza Strip. But it's also this is politically extremely beneficial to Netanyahu, this whole situation going down.
Hmm.
Netanyahu was in the middle of a corruption scandal. Netanyahu was facing a coalition finally being built against him. He was the most pressure he's ever been under during the entire time he's been prime minister. There was even questions of Arab parties joining this coalition to oust him. It was a huge, huge news. And with these recent developments, the right wing faction of that coalition has dropped out, that coalition has crumbled, and it seems Israel is headed towards another round of elections. And so not only has this benefited Netanyahu by destroying the coalition being built against him that could have finally ousted him, but if there's anything that helps the far right in Israel, it's conflict in the Gaza Strip.
Yeah. Do you think this is a little bit too convenient?
Political, yes, political in nature, of course. The thing is, people have this idea that these foreign policy decisions are isolated from like the irrationality of human beings or from these like deeply domestic political decisions that are not strategically or economically make sense. But the problem is people will just say whatever a domestic audience wants to hear or will make foreign policy moves in favor to get domestic approval, even if accepting the Hamas proposed ceasefire via Russia would save more lives, even if going on with the international community would be the better move, even if forming a coalition against Netanyahu right now to actually move forward on peace in the Middle East would be the better move. For Netanyahu and the far right, conflict with Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, yelling at Muhammad Abbas, and conflict with Fatah, these are things that benefit Netanyahu and are going to get Israeli voters into the poll booths to vote Likud. Likud being Bibi, which is also Netanyahu's name.
Yeah,
party.
I mean, we see this all the time here in America too. The way the conservatives start lubing up the moment they see like a shooting of a police officer or some other, or remember when the guy shot those 5 police officers a couple years back at a Black Lives Matter rally? Was it?
Yeah.
Yeah. So when something like that happens, they're like, we get to talk about this for the next 5 years, baby. This is going to be on every news station until we say it isn't. Thatcher did this. We did this. The Middle East engagement, and Iran does this. Their constant anti-Western propaganda drumming gets exacerbated anytime American politicians take action against them, and that cements their power further.
I mean, we could point to the Iraq War. We could point to Afghanistan. We can point to what happened after 9/11. But it's its own propaganda. It's its own campaign. When Netanyahu has been saying you can't negotiate with these groups, you can't negotiate, you can't negotiate. We should probably annex the Israeli settlements. Saying all this stuff, and then you, as an Israeli citizen, are sitting in your room, and then you hear sirens, and you have to run to the local bomb shelter because Hamas has been firing rockets 24/7. As you see them blown up in the sky by the Iron Dome defense system.
Which looks very cool.
That is a campaign. That is perfect for the far right. That is nothing but an advertisement for them. I suspect in the next round of elections, we're going to probably see a resurgence.
Well, yeah, of course. It's a spectacular propaganda piece. Now, not only do you see the rockets coming in during the nighttime, you also get to see the impenetrable wall of military force that American military aid purchased, defending them. A literal physical representation of the bulwark of, like, fascist militarism, you know? Mm-hmm. As long as you keep supporting us, as long as you keep giving us money, we can continue to afford this absurdly cool anime defense system. And if you don't, well, then, hey, the rockets land on the ground, you know?
The thing that also I would point to is the environment that's currently on the ground in Israel with multiple lynchings being played on live television. Of course, they're not played on live television in a good light, but just camera crews wandering around. I was like, oh, there's a lynching. Let's turn the camera on that. And we see Arabs being pulled out of cars and beaten in the street. Not only beaten till they're unconscious, but then continually beaten after they're unconscious, after death. And then later in mixed neighborhoods, you'll then see you'll see Arabs pulling Jews out of cars and doing something similar. And this going on throughout all of Israel. whether it be in Tel Aviv or mixed Jewish and Arab neighborhoods, Israeli and Arab neighborhoods. This is an environment that does nothing but help the law and order crowd. And if you looked at Bibi's speech that he gave recently, one of like half of the speech was just basically him just repeating the words law and order, restoring law and order, which is going to play well.
Okay. So, with all of this taking place, how far do you think the escalation is set to carry now? Do you think so? Just yesterday, the IDF tweeted that they were beginning a ground invasion of the Palestinian territories. Now, it turns out this was what, a mistranslation, a lie. Several news outlets reported on it and then had to issue retractions because they were just. I don't know if it was some posturing thing, but.
So what happened was that I believe it was either a mistranslation or something of that sort.
Jesus Christ.
But quite quickly, it was about like 10 to 20 minutes after the fact, there was people correcting the fact, whether it be Aura Intel or actually the spokesperson themselves had to correct the fact multiple times. And the Wall Street Journal, even after the fact had been corrected, and the American AFP, Al Jazeera, even after the fact had been corrected, continued to put out news articles saying that there was like a ground, like these troops were moving in. Now, technically, the words attack, ground forces did attack Gaza, but they attacked Gaza because artillery was moved outside of Gaza and fired. It's kind of like how every red car is a car, but not every car is red. Like every attack, like every invasion is an attack, but not every attack is invasion.
Right. It wasn't a full ground occupation of
it was a bombardment, if anything. It was a bombardment is what I referred to it as. What
how far
happened
do you
was,
think
though,
this is
I
gonna
ended
go?
my Twitch stream and I corrected them, and of course after I made my statement saying it was not a ground invasion, then they all corrected it.
Yeah, just the fact that military Twitter accounts are posting misinformation about their own troop movements, just a very very surreal living in this time in human history. How far do you think this is going to go? Do you anticipate an actual invasion, a full-on military occupation? Do you anticipate the further seizure of territory or the implementation of harsher sanctions? What do you expect this climate will beget?
Well, first I want to say that there's no end in sight. Netanyahu has made very clear on television and other locations that he has no intention to accept any ceasefire that has currently been proposed and to continue military operations and to make sure that these airstrikes, in his words, go into the thousands. That is his own statement. So I don't expect there to be a cessation of hostilities anytime soon. Hamas has yet to lower any amount of rocket attacks, so I do think they will continue that. I think artillery will continue to be used as they just started to be implemented yesterday, and so will airstrikes in large amounts. I think as the operation continues to go on, these strikes will continue to get more and more dangerous. The reasoning being that once they took out the most high priority targets, and if they want to continue this operation to save Bibi's political career and like be strategically effective, they're going to go for the more risky targets, the targets that they were not so sure about before. This is kind of like how when Trump went into office, there was a lot of plans that Obama had for military raids and stuff in the Middle East they didn't approve of because, well, they were too risky. But of course, Trump being Trump, approved basically all of them. I see something similar happening that later. Whether it goes into the 2004 Operation Protective Edge type invasion that we haven't seen in about 7 years, it's hard to say. The troops have amassed at the border, and they are fully capable of doing so. So whether it's going to be a ground invasion, we just have to basically wait and see. They most certainly have plans. They have plans ready to do so. It's just a question. It really is just a question of waiting and seeing. But what I can tell you for certain is this is not ending anytime soon, and we're going to see many more airstrikes and many more rockets before we see any type of peace. Bibi and Israel will not accept any ceasefire anytime soon.
Okay. And you are of my opinion, then, that the onus predominantly falls on Israel to assume responsibility for peace because they are the entities with power and influence in the region?
There have been multiple ceasefires proposed. They have yet to accept a single one. Whose fault is that? It's pretty obvious.
Okay. What do you say, then? Because, so, the natural question is, what do we do? I mean, we can't do anything. I know there are steps that would be helpful. Palestine being recognized as a UN nation, that would help at least grant it some protections and more consideration, but we're not going to let that happen.
Nope.
So
2019, they tried to do that. The United States, on the UNSC, vetoed it.
do you think we're seeing a positive shift? Because right now, people like AOC, Ilhan Omar, her reputation being, contentious on this issue, but still, have been pretty explicitly condemning Israel, not just in the flowery, hearts and minds, peace and love type deal, but very explicit. Netanyahu is a far-right ethno-nationalist. This is reprehensible. This is a genocide. Do you think this may mark a turning point where at least the Democratic Party moves towards open condemnation of Israel? Because before, it used to be support of Israel, ignoring Palestinian people. This was a unilateral issue, a unanimous issue. We all agreed on that.
So I would say that internationally, of course, this has been consensus has always been that much of the onus is on Israel. They're the one with the power. They're the one with the strength. If there's going to be any peace done, they're the one with all the leverage. They're the one who has the illegal settlements in the West Bank. Of course, Hamas has done terrible war crimes as well, as I talked about with their storing of weapons in UN schools next to school children. But the mass majority of the leverage is on Israel. When it comes to a United States perspective on this, I think that it is different on how it's being covered. The fact that we had that CNN interview that was actually had a Palestinian on the ground, giving their perspective and giving it kind of unfiltered. It's being covered a little bit more positively. I mean, not positively, but you know what I mean. There's more Palestinians, voices being raised up. And it's strange to see, at least for me, it's not strange bad, but just strange. I'm not used to it, to see Congress people just openly come out and condemn Netanyahu, condemn what's going on, and call on a stop to the violence and call for direct action on this, whether it be through aid, what I have personally called for, which is moving the embassy out of Jerusalem, or at least using that as leverage.
That would be very nice. Yeah.
Remember
what Trump said when he did that? I was like, wow, the evangelicals are even more happy about this than the Jews are,
It was that was him doing what I was talking about earlier. It was him considering a political situation to make a foreign policy decision, which undermines the leverage the United States had in negotiations between Israel and Palestine. It was a stupid foreign policy move of no, exactly 0 cents. Now, I will say this though. As much as I say there's new voices in Congress speaking up, there's new voices in media speaking up. If you look at Democratic Party leadership or the entirety of the Republican Party, the situation is completely different. Steny Hoyer released a statement simply saying that Israel has a right to defend itself. I don't see Nancy Pelosi releasing any statements about the need for America to use its leverage. Joe Biden, of course, released a statement just saying Israel has a right to defend itself.
Yep.
And everybody saw the Andrew Yang tweet. And there's nothing wrong with the statement in isolation. Israel has a right to defend itself. If someone launches a missile at your home, of course, the idea that you have
it's the implication, the unspoken.
It is nothing wrong with the content. It is the context.
Yeah,
it is the context.
But that's how it always goes, isn't it? I mean, I will say I'm heartened by media figures' perspective on this. You see people like Trevor Noah, John Oliver, who are pretty loud voices in the broader left-leaning, media circuit, and they're pretty clear in their condemnation of Israel on this issue. So that's positive, at the very least. I mean, that's a long way away from...
It is progress. It's just, for me, I don't think it's progress fast enough for we to see real movement in this situation in particular. This situation in particular,
we're moving too slow to do anything
about. Now, there's just I don't see any political opportunity from any powers involved to do anything to stop the violence.
Just usually,
let's if we think about the powers involved, you have the Jordanian kingdom, which currently doesn't have a great relationship with the state of Israel, and so I doubt they'll be able to be a decent intermediary. Then you have the state of Israel, which Netanyahu is having his own personal short-term conflict with the far right because he restricted access to the Temple Mount. There's been extreme political division. Netanyahu's in a corruption scandal, and they're going to go through another election cycle, and the coalition that was going to form against him has collapsed. So I don't see anyone with any political leverage or even political functionality with the Knesset going into election after election after election to really make any bold moves on peace between Israel and Palestine. Then you go to the United States and Joe Biden says, well, we had Jake Sullivan talk to Israeli officials and we did technically stop this vote to condemn what Israel did. It was 14-15 on the USC, and we were the one state that stopped it. And our reasoning, we said, on why we didn't want to condemn the evictions in East Jerusalem with the UN vote was, well, we would use our direct diplomacy to bring an end to the violence. And we sent Jake Sullivan. Joe Biden's released the statement of Israel's right to defend itself, and nothing has happened, and we've seen no indication from Netanyahu that he's going to stop the violence anytime soon. So I don't see any real motivation from Joe Biden. Like, he might be sending these diplomats and encouraging Bibi to do something, but I don't think he's going to use the leverage that I want him to. I don't think he's going to be able to say, like, hey, we are perfectly willing to reverse Trump's decision to move the embassy to Jerusalem. We are perfectly willing to talk about lessening or eliminating our military aid in consideration of what's currently going on. I don't see that conversation being had, and so I don't see any parties involved that are willing to make real moves here. So I think this violence is just going to perpetuate itself.
All we can do is watch them die. Okay, but we can watch, or we can plant seeds for the future. We can make arguments today. That's what you've been doing. It's of course what I've been doing. Now, you've argued with people on this, and you know the lines that you get faced with. Okay, first of all, there's the very immediate law and order, hyper-defensive fascist stuff. We have a right to defend ourselves. Like, you don't even engage with the premise. Just, we have a right to defend ourselves. They're violent. They send rockets at us. It's not even engaging with the premises here. When you encounter arguments like that, what's your approach? What's your rhetorical strategy? Because, and it's hard to say this because this language seems as though it overlaps with a lot of conspiratorial thinking, but it's true that Israel is a delicate topic in the United States of America, and there are bad faith actors who will weaponize accusations of anti-Semitism to prevent criticism of Israel. And I find that horrible. I think it's anti-Semitic to directly attach a people to a state and to thus make each group culpable for the behavior of the other. I think that's a reprehensible thing to do, but people do it anyway. So how do you approach stuff like that?
Personally, what I will say is, of course, every state and every people have a right to defend itself, but is example A defending themselves? Is example B defending themselves? And I'll bring up examples of the callousness used by Israeli forces at times to when quote unquote defending themselves was during the border protests in 2018 when this Israeli sniper killed 2 medics. Were those Hamas medics that were actually had med kits for Hamas? What about that reporter? That reporter have a rocket in his camera that were going to blow away all the Israeli soldiers? And I'll bring up these examples, or these UN's or these recent UN schools. Have we have any evidence so far that was really a necessary step to defend the state of Israel when there were many other targets around? Or let's look at the death toll casualty numbers in comparison, and that's what I'll do. Of course, states and peoples have a right to defend themselves, even though it seems that the State Department is unwilling to say that Palestinians have a right to defend themselves. It is the question of, is this an effective self-defense, number one, and are these things actually making people's lives safer? Those would be the two. Because if every time I pulled a trigger, there was a 50-50 chance it would kill a civilian, I would really be reconsidering pulling that trigger.
What do you say to the explicit ethno-nationalists? This is our territory, our ancestral homeland. The Palestinian people have no right to live here. It's unfortunate, but we cannot work together. We cannot live together. They must be expelled from this, from this place to live. So I have seen people just go full forward. For example, Ben Shapiro. Ben Shapiro has actually come out with an opinion piece on his proposed solution to the Middle East, and it is as simple as removing Arabs from the region. So it's, he's a fairly popular conservative pundit. It seems to me like there are probably many conservatives who reflect that.
Ooh, are you familiar with one of his old articles on this issue? I actually have
familiar with at least a few.
Here.
Are we talking?
This is one he has yet to condemn, actually. It's titled. Would you like me to read a few captions from this from Ben Shapiro?
Please do.
It is titled "The Radical Evil of the Israeli Arab Population." Now let's go down here. Ah, the fabled Palestinian people. The Palestinian people who simply want a better life. The Palestinian people who President George W. Bush has repeatedly informed us long for a society in which they can raise their children in peace and hope. The Palestinian people who support, fund, and execute suicide bombings. The Palestinian people who dress their toddlers in bomb belts and take family snapshots. The Palestinian people who cheered on September 11th as the World Trade Towers fell. The Palestinian people who followed terrorist extraordinaire Yasser Arafat, supported Saddam Hussein, shredded the blooming rose that was Christian Lebanon, and almost toppled the Western-friendly Jordanian monarchy. The Palestinian people who destroy relics on the Temple Mount openly call for the destruction of the State of Israel, ally with Syria and Iran, and elect Hamas. The Palestinian people who teach their children that the Holocaust is a fairy tale and that Jews routinely poison Palestinian candy. The Palestinian people who stage injuries in order to solicit Western media sympathy and then roar madly as they hold up their hands red with the blood of murdered Israeli soldiers. The idea of an entire population corrupted by bloodthirsty anti-Semitism and anti-Americanism violates modern ideas of politics. Now the
seems pretty straightforward.
Yeah, it's pretty bad. Yeah. His stance. The thing is, he can come out and condemn a lot of his old statements, but the real substance of the policies that he believes in when it comes to Israel,
Palestine, he believes every fucking word. Nah, if times were different, alt universe, Ben Shapiro would be the architect of mass slaughter of Arab people, 100%. The way that dude talks about Arab people, he could absolutely be sending them to death camps if he had the power to do so. The rhetoric is so explicitly clear from one point to another. I mean, everything that you just said right there sounded like it could have been like a Goebbels radio broadcast, you know, about Jewish people. Just the ridiculous stretching of time, history, and context to assign all evil in the known universe to one ethnic group.
Here's another line from it. The problems run deeper than a few figureheads. The Palestinian Arab population is rotten to the core.
So yeah, Dylan, how do you talk to people like that? What do you have a particular... Because in my opinion, at that point, you're dealing with Nazi shit. And when you're at Nazi shit, it's not about arguing them out of their biases. It's more about making them cry and look bad publicly, which is also what Ben Shapiro does to his opponents, or at least tries to. So there's some parallel there.
Well, I would, of course, compare this to historical mass expulsions like the Armenian genocide. I would compare it to what's currently going on Nagorno-Karabakh to Armenians. I could, of course, just say there's nothing genetically inferior about the Palestinian people. They have been living here for generations. They have a right to live here. You don't have a right to steal their home and property, no more than I have a right to go into your home and steal your house and property. And then you can make comparisons. One thing that I usually do is I'll say is I have a community, I have a home, I have a church, I have all these things around me, I have family members, I have friends, and I'd really hate for somebody to come and say, this is mine because, and then make some weird historical argument. Therefore, even though you've lived here your full life and you have full legal right to live here, and the international community is pretty united on this because I want it, you're out of here. I think just comparing them to these historical explosions, ethnic cleansings, and bringing up the fact that these are human beings and the humanitarian effect is the best thing to do for an audience. But there's nothing you can do to convince the person, and the intent should never be to convince the person. It's a waste of time. It should be make it very clear to the audience exactly who you're dealing with here.
Yeah, well, the goal with those people would always be to unmask them, right? With somebody like Ben Shapiro, he comes off as very affable, friendly even. His tweets, you know, well, hey, look at my cowboy hat, look at my one plank of wood, you know? When he argues with the college students, the intellectual ownage he delivers to them is always like a, you know, it's like, it's in good sport. It always seems that way with him. But underlying all of that is what seems to be a real and legitimate seething fucking ethnic hatred.
There was this recent tweet, and this just happened, where somebody was like, I think it was Anthony Blinken, who is not some crazy lefty. He's a centrist as centrists come. He's the Secretary of State for the Biden administration, and he tweeted out like Jews and Palestinians both deserve equal rights. That's a very bland tweet, right? Very bland. Yeah. Ben Shapiro responded to it with Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, all the terrorists of the Palestinians do, basically saying if Palestinians want equal rights, then Hamas needs to stop.
That's like, funny. He's doing the same thing to that tweet that we did to Yang's tweet from the opposite perspective, where he didn't take issue. Well, he does take issue with the content of the tweet, but he was attacking the context of the tweet, you know?
Yeah, but he was attacking it in a weird way because under no conditions are people's human rights dependent upon whether their population has terrorists within it.
Nazis have human rights. Everyone has human rights, yeah.
You can use this justification to, let's say, do something in Xinjiang or how we monitored Muslims in New York City. Like that's in their mosques after 9/11. Just because a population might have a few terrorists within it does not mean you can justify the taking away of the human rights. I can't just start monitoring every white man in America because of the Ku Klux Klan.
Well, it depends on what kind of tanky pill you're on. As if we needed the Ku Klux Klan to justify the erasure of white men from America, am I right?
Of course.
Right. So it's difficult to have these arguments, of course, because it's a very sensitive subject. To what extent do you think... So this is what I say often. America cares about Israel for two reasons. One, it's a military base, and it is. We maintain a lot of relevance in the region because of Israel's existence. And B... because of the fundamentalist death cult thing. The Christian fundamentalists, of course, they believe that one of the preconditions for the rapture to come, for them to be whisked off to heaven, is for the Jews to return to their holy land. So, in essence, they can be sacrificed so the Christians can go to heaven. To what extent? Because I've read up on that, and at first when I heard that, it sounded like a conspiracy theory, like some it sounded like some Time Cube level geopolitics. But I read up on it, and it seems like actually, no, there is a really strong trend in the evangelical community to support Israel for religious reasons like that.
So, can I mean, the thing is, I remember recently saying that this was a thing and people told me it's a fairy tale. I remember being like 7 years old in like Bible camp on the weekends, right? Being told directly by my local church that I'm no longer a member of course. Well, okay, the reason why America's failing is because we're considering letting the gays marry each other and because we don't give Israel enough weapons. Just straight up. That was the message delivered directly to me. That was the message delivered to me. That the reason why there's poverty in America, the reason why there's cancer, the reason why there's all these bad things is because we don't give Israel enough weapons and that the gays could get married. Of course, the former at least has been dealt with. So this is something that you'll see when you, for example, JLP, Jesse Lee Peterson, amazing. He released a video recently, which I looked at, and you should look at this video. It is an interesting video to say the least. It's about 8 minutes. It's an interesting watch, and the reason he gives is basically he gives the worst summary of the conflict in history, and his whole thing is just the Jews are good, the Arabs are evil. Amazing. That's it. And it's just all based off of that religious context. And you want to know what? The vast majority of his listeners, and a lot of people don't realize this, the vast majority of JLP's listeners are like unironic, like supporters of his work and like radio programs and stuff like that.
Which was crazy. When I first met JLP, because I'd heard about him, I saw his debate with Destiny, and I didn't know how authentic any of this was. I mean, he's a character. But when I went and met him, dude believes every word that he says. I think he knows he's a bit silly. I think he understands that, but I still think he believes what he says. And his 100%. Followers seem to too. When he does his radio shows, folks call in and they talk to him like he's legit the savior of them, that he led them out to the flock or whatever.
I've seen gay men call into his show and be like, so I've been suppressing my homosexuality as advised by you for like 5 years now. Like, just like people completely changing their life due to this man's words. As funny as it is to look at the man from a distance, it is also quite scary to see.
Oh, it's terrifying. Yeah, that anyone could find anything JLP has to say convincing is absolutely terrifying. And really, once you accept
and that's the man telling people about foreign policy.
Yeah, once you accept that, you can believe anything else people believe here in America. Like, Oh, the religious fundamentalist justification for Israeli occupation? Oh, yeah, obviously people believe that. People follow JLP, you know? The election hoax? Of course people believe that. They believe JLP. It's kind of the wall you have to break through, you know? It's truly the Joker moment of engaging in online politics, is finding out people take him seriously.
100%. So I would say that that's 100% part of the reason is playing to that domestic audience. I would say also that um, I would describe Israel as more than a military base. I would describe them as one of the most effective military powers in the world.
Mm-hmm.
They have a highly effective air force, a civilian population duly ready for combat, a draft system that has been in place for years. They have nuclear weapons, unannounced, of course, but they do have nuclear weapons, which is a huge game changer for anyone who would actually want to even touch Israel. They have effective armor. They've proven themselves in multiple wars, whether that be 1948, 1967, Yom Kippur, anywhere, to be extremely effective at fighting multiple enemies at once. Yeah,
nation state. The mandatory draft, even for women, which is pretty uncommon. That like every citizen has had some. Everybody in Israel.
That's not true entirely. There are certain religious groups that want exceptions.
Oh, sorry. I was going to say either has been or has connections to somebody in the military. You know.
Yes. 100%.
Yeah. There's no getting away from it. Even here in America, which is pretty gung ho with its military, there are cities of people who have never met a soldier in their entire lives. Suburbs tend to produce the soldiers, you know? Suburbs and more rural areas, disproportionately, that's where people enlist from. But in the larger population centers, you can go your whole life without ever seeing one, except maybe at the airport from time to time. In Israel, this is day-to-day news, information on rocket attacks, updates on Hamas. You have family members going off to serve. You went off to serve. All of your neighbors, everyone served. You all have firearm training.
Think about it, too. Think about it too, because let's say you're somebody that's like, oh, I don't know about this whole service thing, and then you hear the sirens come on. What is a better thing to recruit people to the Israeli military than the constant ringing of those sirens as rockets go into homes? And you see, and recently, 7 people have died from these Hamas rocket strikes, including a child. It is really horrific how Hamas has targeted children and civilians. That will do nothing but perpetuate the conflict and act as a recruiting tool.
No, oh yeah, I mean, again, it's very, very good propaganda for the IDF and for Netanyahu, you know? Constant air raid sirens and what have you. When do you get the most recruits? When do you get the most war fervor? During wartime. London, England, during the bombings, you know? After Pearl Harbor, the United States. When you feel like you're under attack, more people get gung-ho, more people get nationalistic, and Israel always feels like it's under attack. But of course, the attacks it's suffering are comparatively paltry compared to what it dishes out in return. And Israel maintains the conditions by which the attacks take place. The attacks will never stop. Rocket attacks will never stop so long as Israel exists there and refuses to use diplomacy with its neighbors. But that's good for them.
Here's the thing.
That's what they want.
These missile strikes. Now that's not what I don't believe that's what the Israeli population want, but I do think there's certain individuals in Israel,
the military-industrial complex, the higher ups. I imagine the population is quite sincere in their belief in self-defense.
Of course, and of course, every state, including Israel, has a right to self-defense. But when we make that statement, we need to make it in a broader context. The thing for me, give me a moment here. Let me just remember what I was going to say. I lost it for a second. Now I lost it. Well, let's go forever.
Ain't nothing. No, of course, sorry. When I say they, I'm referring to the military-industrial complex, Netanyahu, people who benefit from a perpetual military. I'm sure the Israeli population wants to live in peace. I am positive of this. They want nothing. No air raid sirens, no rocket attacks. I imagine they would love to live in a country where they didn't feel they have to enlist, you know, as a matter of course. But we know how this goes down. In order to maintain this constant acquisition, the people have to be kept afraid, so they are.
There's this thing that I hear all the time, and it's the idea that, well, this group wants to destroy Israel, wants to put it into the sea, and you know what? That is something that is in Hamas's charter. That's very clear from Hamas's intentions. Palestinian Islamic Jihad is even more radical than Hamas and also has similar intentions. Right. This is true. And this is a reality they have to deal with. That these are bad groups who will target civilians, kill civilians, and store weapons like right next, like in UN schools. Right? These are not friendly people. Um, that is reality. But when we talk about this, every time somebody says that, it always kind of leaves me standing there like, okay, that's their intention, but we all know that's not going to happen, right?
Right.
Like it's physically impossible. There is no way that a group of people with cheap drones, balloons, and rockets that don't even have a high effectiveness rate due to the Iron Dome defense system is going to beat a nuclear power with one of the most effective militaries in the world in a history of winning wars in the region, whose relationship with other Arab states with Arab states in the region only is improving. Like I don't. It's something that I feel like it'd be like if I said, you know what, everyone, I'm going to take down Minnesota. Like I might try, and it might be terrible. Whatever I do to take down Minnesota, flood
I
their
support
local
you.
economy, or whatever, do whatever it is for this targeting of Minnesota. But we also would all have to acknowledge in whatever response Minnesota does or whatever thing that happens that I'm not going to take down Minnesota. I don't have the power to do that.
Yeah, of course. Well, again, we've dealt with this in America with crime before. Because this is the same law and order rhetoric. You see it everywhere. It all boils down to the same fundamental argument. What do police do? They protect us. What do they protect us from? The gangs. Are the gangs evil? Sure, they do a lot of terrible stuff. But over-policing doesn't fix it. Punitive laws doesn't fix it. These solutions do nothing but perpetuate the problem. It's a systemic solution you're looking for. And Israel, again, the government of Israel, obviously not the people, I don't even think they make an effort at diplomacy in their region. The idea to them that they should have to fall in line in the same way other nations have to make compromises with their neighbors, I don't think this is something that even I don't think it's something they're willing to acquiesce to, the government. If they were to actually treat the Palestinian people like an equal or a regional partner with which negotiations must be made, they would have to make concessions that they otherwise really wouldn't have to make if they just kept, kept the game going. And you can do this too with the policing. That's why all the tough on crime types, they never actually want to fix the drug war or deal with qualified immunity or fix systemic oppression in these neighborhoods that lead to generational inequality. It's always something like that. They get to keep the system going. Unfortunately, the problem between
The thing
Israel
is,
and Palestine,
when the violence starts, the far right loses support.
when the violence
That's just when the
stops, you mean?
violence stops.
Oh, you
The
said
far
starts.
right will lose support.
Yes, yes.
When it stops, there's no way that Bibi and Netanyahu is going to be able to keep power if Hamas is no longer a threat. There's no way that even the blue and white party would be able to get, even though that's already like
But
a dead
Hamas
party.
will
But I'm
not
just,
go away if Israel keeps acting this way. I mean, how could they
yeah.
not? The Palestinian people, they feel as though they need to turn
The
to
thing
something.
is, dealing with terrorism is a lot more than just blowing something up. I think we should have learned that right now with ISIS. We've seen a resurgence of ISIS in northeastern Syria, largely due to Trump's withdrawal, by the way, which has increased ISIS operational capability and reduced anti-ISIS raids by the SDF. I do want to always take a chance to jab at Trump for the withdrawal. But
Are you
yes, there's multiple
suggesting
ways.
that
Mhm.
Israeli special forces do this? Because Israel always does this shock and awe thing. Oh, Hamas fired bottle rockets at our hospital. Well, we'll carpet bomb X or Y. It's always big, flashy.
Well,
If they sent operatives in, are you suggesting they covertly deal with Hamas?
well, I wouldn't want to call them bottle rockets considering they've killed children. But
No. But comparative to their weapons tech, you understand what I'm.
yeah, I understand. I don't want to get clipped and shipped on that.
Fair.
So the thing for me is the only way you deal with terrorism, and I had this debate with some conservative yesterday who called me an agent of Hamas, is the idea that number one, yes, you have to strike and attack terror groups, but that isn't the end of it. If you just strike and blow something up, then you haven't dealt with the situation that caused that group to come to fruition. You haven't dealt with the poverty. You haven't dealt with the education. You haven't dealt with the radicalization. You haven't dealt with the geopolitical forces involved. There is a lot of other things you need to do to actually stop terrorist groups from rising up. If we just blew up ISIS and then left, that doesn't mean terrorism's solved. That's ridiculous. You need to give people a reason to not want to even entertain these radical
Video
ideas.
games, anime, body
True.
pillows. You got to give them something, because you give them nothing, they all turn to terrorism. Same with us, by the way. Same with us.
No.
1776, no anime, no body pillows, no video games. What did we do? We revolted.
Now, of course, this doesn't mean that rich people don't get involved in terrorism. Osama bin Laden, it was very famous, the Egyptian hijacker on 9/11. But what I will say is that statistically, it's proven that in areas with higher rates of poverty, you're more likely to turn to violent crime. The same thing is true for terrorism.
Of course. But you do believe it is Israel's responsibility to use its military might to execute Hamas, or execute or arrest Hamas leaders. That you believe that Israel should be able to intercede in Palestinian territory to do as such, even though the Palestinians don't have the ability to intercede on Israeli territory and arrest their military leaders who bomb their UN facilities and what have you.
That's a difficult question to answer, but I do believe that Hamas leaders who are organizing strikes on civilians, anyone who organizes strikes on civilians, I believe someone has the moral justification to attack that person.
Okay. No, I think I agree with that. This is
But
one of those.
that's a universal standard, though.
Yeah, and this is one of those shaky. I mean, it's complicated. That's always going to be one of those shaky answers. You're never going to get fair play when there are two groups that have wildly unequal power between them, because only one of those two groups will have the ability to make their will known. Here, the Palestinians just have to. I mean, what is it? The strong will do what they will. The weak must suffer what they must. I mean, that's exactly what we're dealing with here, really.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, at the end of the day, like it's if Israel has the vast majority of the strength, they have the vast majority of military power. That's why they're able to use force so overwhelmingly in comparison to any group on the ground in the Gaza Strip. But at the end of the day, we must also acknowledge that if somebody is planning to target civilians, to attack civilians, or to just kill the innocent, then of course the state has a moral responsibility to protect those civilians. The question should be, though, is these actions being taken to protect civilians when ceasefires are on the table, when there's also the question of were all these strikes made in a precise manner to also consider the death toll on the Palestinian population? Were these strikes done, like, for example, when we look at the border protests and these journalists killed and the medics killed, like I find it very hard to believe that when the medic is shot, that they're shooting the medic to combat terrorism.
Of course. Yeah, and it always starts like that. Small criticisms of the overreach of Israeli military power lead into larger criticisms of their broader strategy in the region. But if you can get a Zionist, or whatever, a fascist, any type to defend Israel's actions altogether, to back off of defending something like that, then that's a good start, you know? If you can get them to admit some things are over the line, you can work them out from that point.
I would also want to bring up the fact that this is like something that's been interesting going on so far. Have you seen that there's been rocket attacks from other countries as well into Israel now?
Yeah, I heard that, but I didn't know how reliable that information was. There's been a lot of fake news going on about...
So I can tell you that so far, there's been a rocket attack from Lebanon.
Mhm.
Now, those people who were involved were arrested by Lebanese authorities. And Hezbollah did not claim that they were behind it, which if Hezbollah started launching rockets at Israel, that is very, very, very dangerous and a huge escalation.
Do you think they backed off it? Like, they fired the rockets, then they saw how things were going with Israel, and they were like, wait, nope, that was just two guys. Never mind. We're not affiliated with these jokesters over here, you know?
I mean, of course, it's physically possible, but there are enough groups and enough people involved in anti-Israeli terrorism to have been anybody. So I can't make any claims in the positive or in the negative. But also, there's recently been there has been like some missile strikes launched from outside of Syria now towards Israel.
Mhm.
And now everybody's trying to scrambling to figuring out like, okay, what exactly was that? Who launched the rockets? What's the response going to be? Because then this gets into conversation about incursions into Syria and incursions into Lebanon, which would expand the conflict. And the more this conflict expands, the more dangerous it gets, of course. I
course.
assume out of Syria, it was most likely an IRGC-backed paramilitary.
So I guess we're just going to have to see how it goes down.
Yeah, I mean, I guess obviously, like I would tell people to contact their congressman, do all the weird activism stuff. If you see any protests in your area, of course, like get involved in that. Do your best to raise awareness. Obviously, it's pretty doomer right now, but in order to change what was the Overton window, we need to continue to bring attention to this.
Hmm. Would you be willing to come on sometime in the near future? No doubt the situation will update significantly within a week.
Sure. Yeah, I'd be perfectly willing to. Yeah.
All right. Thank you for coming on. Do you have any final points? Any big brain takes to throw out?
Look, I believe Keemstar said it best. Israel and Palestine need to study John Lennon's Imagine. Okay, truly a big brain take on the issue. You can find my stuff at Dylan Birds TV on Twitch. That's DYLANBURN TV. You can find it also on YouTube, which I'm almost at 30K subs, so I'd appreciate any support getting me there. That'd be DYLANBURNS TV as well. And on Twitter, that's DYLANBURNS1776 because I'm so patriotic and a God-fearing American.
Gotcha. Well, best of luck. We're both good luck being called a Hamas supporter in your future debates.
Did I ever tell you about the time I was called out by a Netanyahu allied reporter?
Really?
Yeah, do you want to hear the story quick?
Quick, yeah. Hit me with it.
So when I was working on the Michaela campaign, there was somebody who was a member of the Lahai, which I don't know how to pronounce it correctly, and my throat hurts, so I can't really do it right now. It was a terrorist organization, a pro-Israeli terror organization that openly called themselves a terrorist organization and also like slaughtered Palestinians and wanted to work with the Nazis at one point to ally themselves with them in order to like get all the Jews over to like Israel. And I was criticizing the person because she was the spokesperson for a terrorist organization, and me doing that, this reporter, and at the time I had like 300 followers on Twitter, and I was just like working on the campaign stuff. I was doing the elbow work, you know, doing all the hard work and getting none of the credit, and she sees that I did this and responds with basically just like, "Screw you, you're a Holocaust denier," and then everybody started adding my campaign, and I still don't understand where that claim came from.
Do they need an excuse? I mean, these types?
I don't know. All I know is that she's a pretty far-right individual, and she just wanted to throw that at me to, I guess, like kind of ruin my life at the time. And yeah, of course, I had to have meetings with the campaign. Thankfully, they were very understanding. But yeah, that was something that could have endangered my employment.
I'm glad that it didn't tank your employment. Thank you for coming on.
As well.
I'll be happy to have you on in the future so you can continue to not tank your employment as best as you can.
Awesome. You have a good one, okay?
Take care.
See you later.